MultiGreen, building attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily real estate through impact investing.
Welcome to the MultiGreen podcast. I'm your host, Randy Norton, and today we'll be speaking with Anirban Basu, the chairman and CEO of Sage Policy Group. He's an economist with an engaging personality, and we discuss how new construction practices, along with a new generation of leaders, might resolve housing challenges, and his predictions in future multifamily development. Enjoy our conversation. Anirban, thank you so much for being on the MultiGreen podcast today.
Oh, it's an absolute privilege, Randy. Glad to be here. Look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. I think the first time you and I met was certainly pre-COVID, but I've been following you since at least 2005 through the Construction Finance Management Association, and you've been our chief economist since that time. So from 2005 until now, there's been a lot of change, but I want to start with your name because it's a very interesting name you don't hear so often, and I was doing some research. I believe your first name means something like a light that shines forever, and that your last name means something like dwelling in all beings. So if you put your first and last name together, it means a light that shines forever, dwelling in all beings. Can you please opine?
Yeah, that's exactly what it means. And my first name, I think, is more interesting than my last name, Anirban, which is basically not nirvana. So in Indian languages, you might hear the term nirvana referred to as nirban. So my name is not Nirban. Anirban is that the way it's spelled. As it turns out, I pronounce it Anirban. Nirvana means a popping out of existence. Therefore, the opposite of that, which is my first name, means a light that shines forever, as you indicated, or a light that never dies. And so, the Buddhist conception is that life is painful and that to reach nirvana means to pop out of existence, to end the endless cycle, otherwise endless cycle of rebirths. For Hindus, the notion is, if you're going to be reborn, you're going to be reborn, and you hope to be born as something advantaged as opposed to something disadvantaged, like a flea. But may the good times roll, right? Let life go on, and look forward to the next rebirth, and hopefully we'll get it right this time. And so that's what my name is about. I
love your name. I think it's a fantastic name. It's very distinguished, and I don't think there's any other economist that I'm aware of that has that name. So for all that's listening throughout the world, we are with Anirban Basu, and he's with Sage Policy out in Washington, D.C. He has been consulting some of the largest organizations in the world on construction and financial matters, economic matters. And with that background, Anirban, what is going on in the world today? We have so many inputs and outputs that are confusing me in the underwriting process. I'm just going to throw that out there and let you take it where you want.
Here's what's going on. It's a pandemic that tore through the economy. It really tore through the supply side of the economy. It also tore through the demand side of the economy, but very briefly. And so what happened is that for a time, demand faded. This is March and April of 2020. We lost 22 million jobs as a country. The world economy entered recession. The U.S. economy entered recession. But then since that time, we've had this V-shaped recovery where demand has been extremely strong for goods and now services. But the supply side of the economy semi-shut down during those early months of the pandemic. And because of supply chain disruptions, because of labor force dynamics we can talk about, it's been very difficult to reconstitute the supply side of the economy. So what are you left with? Scarcity, shortage, inflation. So that's the world we're living with right now, and it's all ushered forth by this pandemic and the jarring effects of the pandemic. First to cause demand to plummet and then demand to skyrocket, in part because government responded to the pandemic by stimulating consumer spending, directly sending payments to households, for instance. The Federal Reserve responded by keeping interest rates ultra low, which also stimulated demand. So the supply side economy has never been able to catch up. This is also true in construction, of course. You can see this in materials prices. The fact that materials prices are up 24% on a year-over-year basis. You can see this in the labor force with contractors struggling to fill available positions. You can see this in equipment shortages. Many contractors complain that they've had projects delayed because they haven't been able to procure the right types of equipment on a timely basis. So you put it all together, that's the world we're in right now. Inflationary and frustrating.
So in an inflationary and frustrating environment, how does one best execute on projects, and how does one best optimize the contractual environment?
one enters into obligations very carefully. Right? So when you're a contractor, you're signing a contract. And I would say that the role of the construction attorney has never been as important as it is now. Typically, I do not praise attorneys, but in this case, they are very useful because it is that attorney who's going to make sure that that right clause gets into the contract such that when you can't get a certain type of material, or that when you can't get a certain type of equipment, or that you suffer an enormous increase in the price of some material, whether it's natural gas or diesel fuel or concrete, whatever it happens to be, that there's an out for you, or at least there's an opportunity for the contractor to reprice their services so that they do not take a huge loss. So that's how you deal with it. You manage your obligations. As we know, the remarkable thing, or one of the remarkable things about this, is that despite these enormous increases in the cost of delivering construction services, demand for construction remains sky high. Many contractors are operating at capacity. They're looking to expand that capacity by taking on more staff, buying more equipment. Frustrating because they can't find that staff, they can't find that equipment. Nonetheless, backlog is elevated right now. So a lot of project owners are moving forward with projects despite these elevated bids. That's the world we live in right now. And how does a contractor deal with it? Contractually, as it turns out. They deal with it by having enough flexibility in their contract such that they're not liable under certain circumstances for damages.
Now, if I remember right, you also went to law school.
That's true. I went to law school.
So what hat do you wear more? Is it on the research and the economic side or the legal side, or do they really work together?
They work together, I think. I'm mostly an economist. I call myself an economist. Pointed out, our firm's name is Sage Policy Group Incorporated. We're actually in Baltimore, Maryland, the greater Washington area, I suppose. And but we're Ravens fans and Orioles fans, as it turns out. So we provide consulting services to developers, to banks, brokerage houses, anyone who's looking for economic analysis. That's what we do. We do it for, in litigation support. So when there's a lawsuit and someone's trying to calculate damages, we're the ones who come in and can't compute damages. That's what we do. But the lawyer part helps, doesn't it? Because the lawyer part of it, I went to the University of Maryland School of Law. It's an excellent law school, expanded my vocabulary. It made my thinking more razor sharp. I get right to the point more quickly, and I'm a more effective speaker. Though you might not be able to tell that from this podcast, this MultiGreen podcast. So, it works together. And if I'm talking to contractors, there is a legal aspect to what they do. Right? They're entering into contracts. They have legal obligations. They also face issues of tort, right? Negligence and those kinds of things. And so it works together, but I'm 9/10 economist.
Your business must be booming in this environment, and contracts absolutely have economic value. I'm learning that every single day. So when we started MultiGreen, our whole goal was to build attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily housing, or for-rent housing. We felt that was one of the bigger needs in the country today. So this year's podcast, we're specifically focusing on attainability. And a part of the theme of the CFMA was always to focus on the waste of labor, the waste of mismanaged time, essentially, the waste of materials, not purchasing them correctly, or the waste that just happens naturally as you construct a building. And there's other waste. There's financial waste and financing cost. But the most expensive of all waste is time, the variable of time. Those four things and those four topics, I'm just trying to manage every day and arrest and stabilize that environment for our contractors and for all of our projects across the country. But it's not so easy to do. Is that just a utopian thought in trying to manage these four things, or is there really a path forward to get more efficient at what we do in the construction industry?
There must be a path forward, but we just have not pursued that path as an industry in general. Here's what I mean by that. We've seen some revolutions in the way in which certain industries deliver goods and services, manufacturing, retail, for instance, with the proliferation of online activity, e-commerce. We've seen some real revolutions, but you look at many construction job sites, they might look a lot like they might have looked in the 1960s, 1970s. And I'm told by many construction executives that the last real revolution in construction was the advent of structural steel, but that was more than a century ago. People in the construction industry tell me, well, technology's coming. We're talking about drones and 3D printing and prefabrication, modularization, and so on and so forth. Yes, that's true. But often, if you look at it, it's nibbling at the edges of the industry. A lot of construction is done the way it has been done for decades, which is one of the reasons that construction exhibits some of the slowest productivity growth among American industries. We've seen massive productivity growth in manufacturing, massive productivity growth in retail trade, massive productivity growth in financial services. Remember when we used to deposit checks using a teller? Don't do that anymore, do we? But construction has been different, so deeply frustrating. So what you get at the end of the day, you get very high construction costs. It is routine in projects to have budget delays, or I should say project delays and overrun budgets. And so there must be a pathway forward. But as an industry, I don't think we've yet identified it or pursued it.
Let's talk about labor for a second. I think two of the biggest delays we see on our projects is number one, with permitting, the just delays that happen in that process. And then the second is production and labor output. We are always understaffed, it seems like. Doesn't matter what market you're in, whether you're union or non-union, it's just really hard to staff projects. So let's just talk about labor for a second. Can we ever solve this issue?
Oh, we can. We just haven't. So number of things going on here. First, for many decades, many Americans and their families have been convinced that the pathway to prosperity is a four-year college degree. That doesn't matter what you major in, could be dance, could be whatever it is, but that's the pathway to prosperity. Get that credential four-year college degree and you're off to the races. And as it turns out, that's true for a lot of people. The college degree is integral to their success, their career success. But for many others, that's not the path. Somewhere out there, for instance, this last semester, some kid was in French literature class, and they're maybe reading Molière's Tartuffe, which of course is his greatest play. And maybe the month before that, they read Jean-Paul Sartre as Being a Nothingness, or Camus' Étrangère, whatever it happened to be. Great works, and this kid was bored out of their skull. It's just not what they want to do. And they're realizing that, but they would be the world's greatest carpenter. But here's the problem. They were never exposed to that opportunity because they didn't take shop class in high school. They didn't get shop class in high school. Their whole high school career was about college preparedness, college readiness. And so we've got a lot of Americans out there who are being underutilized because they're not following their passions because they did not have an opportunity to identify those passions. Their exposure was limited. So one of the reasons we have a shortage of machinists, mechanics, welders, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters, so on and so forth, millwrights. So that's one. The second thing is, of course, we have low birth rates in this country and have had for several decades now. The female fertility rate is obviously female fertility, but 1.73 in this country, an all-time low. Replacement fertility is 2.1. And then, of course, we've had some challenges with respect to establishing coherent immigration policy. And as we know in construction, immigrants have played a very significant role in roofing and many other occupation categories. And so we have to sort this out. But until that time, we're not able to staff up fully. And what I noticed is that many contractors are simply throwing bodies at the problem. So we have seen construction hiring, but output from the industry has not really grown very rapidly. So we're doing less with more people, as it turns out, in many cases. That's an indication of low productivity growth. So there's got to be a pathway forward, to use your terminology. As I say, we have not yet identified it, or at least we've not yet pursued it.
So cities need more engineers of all kinds to approve plans. We need more vocational training for our younger demographic. We need more children produced, and we need immigration and policy reform. I mean, that is a perfect cocktail for a really devastating labor market. Do you see any solution in the near term?
Not in the near term, because a lot of these solutions are political. So, for instance, one of the reasons we don't have enough multifamily housing, for instance, as an example, is that a lot of communities don't want apartments, right? They are not in my backyard. We don't want this. In fact, they're so NIMBY, they don't even want single family homes built in their community. I mean, a lot of these folks, they've found their way into a nice community and now they want to lift up the ladder, right? And their notion is, look, I came here for a rural quality of life. And now I've moved here, and now, I moved here for that quality of life, and now you're proposing more housing. How dare you? Well, of course, they moved to a house that was built for them, or apartment unit that was built for them, but they seem to have forgotten that. So we've got all this restrictive housing. You're right, we don't have enough engineers. Permitting is slow. Some governments have worked to improve that, of course, to streamline permitting processes, but nonetheless, you'll hear many complaints about that. Again, I'm not just going to tell people you need to have more babies, right? We don't do that, right? In this country, right? You have as many babies as you want to have. But the fact of the matter is, even if we had more babies, that's not going to solve the problem in the next 2 decades, right? You can't have 4-year-olds working construction or in anything, as it turns out. And then immigration, that's where I think the solution could occur over a shorter period of time. If we had coherent policymaking with respect to both legal and undocumented migration, I don't know what the number is, if it's 12 million undocumented migrants, but I've always thought we need to find a practical solution. If we're not going to deport, let them live in the light of the day. Let's give them work visas and let them pay taxes and be hired legally and use that human capital that's living within the borders of our country. And then with respect to legal immigration, obviously, we can cherry pick the best and brightest from all over the world because we're a free society capable of accommodating anyone from any cultural background. It's one of our great advantages. It is our greatest advantage, arguably. But we have somehow convinced ourselves that we should not use that advantage, or at least not aggressively. So, here we are with this labor force shortage and aging population and not enough efficient construction.
So you're in the Washington, D.C. MSA. Obviously, you're in Baltimore. You're at the global headquarters of policymaking. Sage Policy is the name of your company. And I'm sure you advise companies like MultiGreen in their policies and procedures. So if we want to build 40,000 multifamily units between now and 2030, what policies, economic or otherwise, do you think that we need to implement so that we can satisfy all of these shortages and unstable contract environments that we're in today?
You need new politicians,
okay.
Right? You need a different generation of politicians. So which generation is being hurt the most because of this structural shortage of housing? It's the millennials. That's our largest generation. Many of those millennials are now in their 30s, some are in their 40s. A few years ago, the joke was they're living in parents' attics and basements, and they were. But then during a previous decade, they started moving into apartments. We saw that apartment building boom during the previous decade. But that generation is so massive that even with that boom, we didn't build enough apartment units. And of course, we didn't build many single family homes after the Great Recession, during the foreclosure crisis, so on and so forth. So just not enough housing is out there, especially for young families. So what do they end up doing? They try to buy a home. They want to buy a home, can't afford it. And now with mortgage rates rising this year from the low 3s into the mid 5s, housing has become even less affordable. So what do? They rent. But there are not enough apartment units out there. So what happens? They end up paying a fortune in rent. Some of these communities, Phoenix, Arizona, Tampa, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, Austin, Texas, rents are climbing 19, 20, 25%, on a year-ago basis. Young families can't afford that. They can't invest as much money in their children, for instance, their education or otherwise when that happens. So that generation has to wake up to the fact, and maybe they have woken up to the fact that we have a lack of affordable housing even for the middle class, by the way. I'm not talking Section 8. I'm talking affordable housing for many strata of society, including the middle class. And we have not built enough housing for Americans, and that they need to find policymakers, whether at the state level, local level, or the federal level, who say, look, this housing shortage is a real problem. We need to help people live near their work. And of course, increasingly people are working in their homes. That's true, but still, many people commute. About 60% of jobs still have to be done in person, at least. You have to elect a new generation of policymakers, and that would really help this country.
I agree. So, Anirban, we're trying to build attainable housing, not necessarily subsidized or whatever strata you want to talk about. We're trying to make things more affordable, and we're trying to do it in a sustainable way, and certainly use technology, certainly make these properties tech-enabled. But it seems like the confluence of variables that are happening in construction is counterproductive, and it's the antithesis of making things attainable. Do you see this getting better anytime soon, or how do you project out the next 5 or 10, 20 years in the real estate market?
Well, I think it will get better for the following reason. Developers respond when the price of what they might deliver to the market is rising. In other words, when property becomes more valuable. And right now, because we have this shortage of multifamily units, rents are rising. That's an indication of that shortage, that scarcity. That is a signal to the developer community, rising rents are a signal of scarcity, let me build more units. And we are seeing that in the permits data. If you look at the multifamily permits data across the country, developers are poised to build out more units going forward. So that helps. Unfortunately, because construction materials prices are so high, because compensation for construction workers has risen so rapidly recently, and because just of the general dearth of skilled craftspeople, as it turns out, what we have is a situation in which it's very difficult to develop units that are attainable, right? To use, again, use that word. Very difficult to find units that are attainable because the cost of delivering construction services is so high. So what you get high-end units disproportionately. And so that's fine for people who are, young professionals making tons of money in finance or whatever segment they're making money in technology. But for much of America, it doesn't address their problem. And so that part of it is not going to get better.
As we wrap up the podcast today, what would some of the messaging and signaling you would want to give to the professionals in the construction marketplace or the investors in the construction marketplace, the stakeholders that are trying to focus on this issue? What is your takeaway?
Look, I think one of the things we're going to see over the next few years is a lot of adaptive reuse. Here's what I mean. Because of the specter of remote work, I think we can agree that there's too much office space in this country, at least in many markets. St. Petersburg, Florida might be an exception, right? That's a red hot market. But in much of the country, we have too many office buildings, too much vacant office space. And, many property owners continue to wait for the workers to come back. In large measure, they're not going to come back. So what does that mean? Now you've got an office building that's underutilized. That could be a fabulous apartment building for young families, for instance. Make the conversion. We suffered in 2020 a wave of retail bankruptcies. So among those that went bankrupt were Pure Imports, True Religion, JCPenney, Neiman Marcus, J. Crew, GNC, Lord & Taylor, Brooks Brothers, Guitar Center, Francesca's, you name it. They went bankrupt. And with those bankruptcies come a wave of store closures. So we've got a lot of malls out there that are probably going to falter in the next 5 to 10 years. Adaptively reuse them. Turn them into housing, whether they're affordable or otherwise. Turn them into data centers, fulfillment centers, outpatient medical clinics. So around the country, that's what communities should be thinking about. That built environment, how can we make it more productive? How can we alter it or have it altered by developers such that property is used for its highest and best use? And in many cases, because of the jarring effects of the pandemic and the changes in demand for real estate, a lot of property these days is not being used for its highest and best use. So finding a way to find developers who can convert properties for more effective use, I think that's where we need to be headed. Anirban,
thank you so much for being with us today. You are a light to the industry, and you are definitely a light that will shine forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Join us as we build 40,000 attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily homes by 2030. And if you like the content you're hearing, hit the subscribe button. Follow us at Think MultiGreen and sign up to learn more at www.multi.green.